to Colonial Archive, a weekly review and analysis on the politics of empire and resistance. So, on the last episode, we talked about the conflict between India and Pakistan, and a lot has happened since then. So, on June 13th, Israel launched an unprovoked attack on Iran and it assassinated a number of IRGC or Revolutionary Guard commanders. It also killed a number of nuclear scientists and also targeted apartment buildings where civilian lives and killed a number of civilians. It also targeted Iranian infrastructure. So, for example, it targeted the Iranian public television, it targeted the IRIB, and I think you all saw the famous footage. So, the anchor Sahar Imami was delivering the news, and behind her, similar to how I'm sitting here, a wall behind her started to fall, and there was debris. And then she got up, and fortunately, she wasn't killed, and she came back on air and continued to deliver the news.
یا در اختیار قرار دادن وسیله نقلیه همچنین موضوعات مختلف. خیلی متشکر از اینکه با ما همراه هستید. آنچه که ملاحظه می‌کنید تجاوز رژیم صهیونیستی به خاک جمهوری اسلامی ایران و منطقه صدا و سیما. آنچه که ملاحظه کردید، صدایی که شنیدید، فضای غبارآلوده استودیو
So in addition to IRGC commander, nuclear scientists, and civilian infrastructure, Israel also targeted Iranian media and also military and energy sites. And Iran retaliated. So Iran retaliated very quickly. I think the Israelis were hoping that by decapitating the Iranian leadership, it would be very difficult for Iranians to respond. And I think their hope was that it would be a situation comparable to Syria when Bashar al-Assad fled pretty quickly and there wasn't much resistance. They were probably thinking that after the decapitation, the people would rise up, or a comparable scenario, and then there would be an imminent fall in the government. But that did not happen. So there was a pretty smooth transition. There was a pretty, I think, well-established chain of command. And then Iran started retaliating. So they launched what was called True Promise 3 or Vadeh Sadiq 3. And there were a barrage of missiles that started targeting Israeli military and intelligence sites and also scientific institutes. So in a way, in response to the assassination of Iranian scientists, Iran also targeted a research institute in Israel called the Weizmann Institute, and the Weizmann Institute does collaborate with Israeli intelligence and also Israeli military. So that was the reason that Iran targeted that. And I think what's also interesting here is for these missiles, so the Iranian missiles that are indigenous and homemade, for them to get to Israel, they have to go through several lines of defenses. So they have to go through the defense system that the U.S. has in the Persian Gulf and also in Iraq. And after they pass through that, they also go through Jordanian airspace, and Jordan, that is allied with the U.S. and the U.K., shoots them, tries to shoot the dam and intercept them. And then if Jordan is not able to intercept them, so after they go through the U.S. defensive system, the Jordanian defensive system, then they get to Israel, and the Israeli defense system, they start to act. But despite this multi-layered defensive system, a lot of these missiles have been getting through. We don't have exact numbers, but some of them have been getting through, and they have been causing a lot of damage to Israeli infrastructure. And what's really interesting is that Israel prohibits its citizens from recording or providing footage of the destruction that these missiles are causing. So I think most of the footage that we're getting are from the Arab residents of Israel or foreign journalists. And this was a really bizarre episode that I think Glenn Greenwald also tweeted about. So there is this Washington Post journalist by the name of Evan Hill, and he had provided photos of the destruction to Israeli infrastructure with the exact coordinates in order to say that this is an authentic photo of the barrage of missiles that damage Israeli infrastructure. And then there were all these Zionists tweeting that, oh, Israel has a ban on showing pictures, as if the Washington Post journalist has some sort of legal duty to the Israeli government not to post these photos. And so Even Hill actually ended up locking his X or Twitter account. And now in order to follow him, you have to send a request. I don't know if he has changed it yet, but yesterday when I was checking, it was still locked. So it is difficult to get accurate and comprehensive information about the damage in Israel. But from what we're seeing from the Arab residents and from journalists like Even Hill, you can say that the Iranian missiles are also damaging Israeli infrastructure. The most dramatic part of the U.S.-Israeli conflict is that the U.S. got involved yesterday. So on June 21st, they got involved and they attacked 3 nuclear sites in Iran. And again, there are disputes as to the extent of the damages. So there are some reports that say that this was a stage attack in order to de-escalate, and the U.S. intention is not to prolong the conflict, and the damage because of this was minimal, and they had informed the Iranians beforehand. But then there is also other reports that say that the damage to the 3 nuclear sites was pretty extensive and it cut pretty deep underground. So time will tell which one is true. And so how the Israelis and Americans are selling this war to the American public and also to the international community is that it's the Iraq script again. So they're saying that Iran possesses these dangerous WMDs, these dangerous weapons of mass destruction, namely nuclear weapons, and it cannot be trusted with nuclear weapons. And in order for the world to be safe, Iran has to be dispossessed of its nuclear weapons. And this is what the Israelis said, and now this is what the Americans are saying. And what is the most bizarre case is that American intelligence has told Donald Trump that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. So Tulsi Gabbard said this earlier, even though she has backtracked now after Trump decided to bomb Iran, and she kind of just gave up her whole so-called anti-regime change rhetoric that she had before she became a member of the Trump administration, and now she's backtracking on that.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
Ratioed on X for it, and people are really calling it out. I think they're very unhappy with how she turned out and what a hypocrite she is. But there was credible American intelligence, and also the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, an international organization. I think, the West has a lot of influence over it, but it is supposed to be an international organization. And even though they are influenced by the West to an extent, they also said, so the Director General made a statement publicly, including on CNN, that Iran did not have a systematic effort towards the production of nuclear weapons.
What we informed and what we reported was that we did not have, as in coincidence with some of the sources you mentioned there, that we did not have any proof of a systematic effort to move into a nuclear weapon.
So both the IAEA and American intelligence said that there are no nuclear weapons, but somehow Donald Trump is pretending or is convinced that there are nuclear weapons, and this is what he's trying to sell to the American public. And for this reason, he bombed Iran. And so it is the Iraq 2003 invasion all over again. So if you remember, back in 2003, that was also the claim that Saddam Hussein possesses these dangerous weapons of mass destruction, and we have to go and destroy him and do regime change in Iraq. But then afterwards, it became fully clear that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. And the great irony here is that when Saddam did use chemical weapons, he was supported by the US and the West. He used them against Iran on the Iran-Iraq border, and he was fully supported by the U.S. then. But then he did not have weapons of mass destruction in 2003 when the U.S. invaded. So that was a lie that was told to the American public to justify the war. And I think back then, because of the effect of 9/11, the September 11 attacks, the Americans were far more ready. They had a larger appetite for war, but they don't have it now. But they're using the exact same script in order to justify the attack against Iran. And I think they either think that the American public is stupid, they're a bunch of idiots that will just buy into this lie that is basically a repackaged lie. It's a refurbished lie, in a sense, the same lie that is being refurbished. Or they think that the American public just has no say over this, that their opinion does not matter, and they don't care about the opinion of the American public. And I think the latter is really the case, because at the end of the day, it's the oligarchs and the Zionists that pay the politicians, and they're the ones who are making the decisions, and they do not care about what the American public thinks. And even if it's an unpopular war and an unpopular bombing of Iran, they're still going to pursue it. So another thing that they're not telling the public, or they're lying about, is that they're not telling the public that this is a colonial war of aggression, and it is an instance of colonialism. And the idea here is that if you do not operate within the US-led imperialist system, your country must be destroyed. In order to understand the context here and to understand why this is not just, I mean, because if you watch the mainstream Western media and the legacy media and the Israeli media, you get the impression that, this is just two countries fighting, and one of them is a little bit more dangerous, namely Iran, and it might have nuclear weapons. And that's how they're presenting it. Just two countries fighting, and the U.S. has to come and clean up the mess. But what it really is, the kind of the prohibited word on the legacy media is colonialism or imperialism. They are not using these two words, but it is a colonial war of aggression. And in order to understand this, we have to understand the context of colonialism and how it has continued and carried on. So if you look at colonialism in its early days, so say from the 16th century all the way to the end of the 19th century, a major part of colonial discourse in order to justify colonial expansion and colonial plundering of the colonized world was the idea of civilizing mission, the idea of civilizing mission that also had a discourse around it. So it was so powerful that it was so entrenched that you could not really question it. It was just part of the common sense of the colonialists, and I think even in the colonies, people started internalizing it. And the idea was that because we're culturally and morally superior, we have the right to rule over you, and we have the right to dispossess you of not only your land and resources, but also of your identity. And this is why you had the dimming or the erasure of identities of the colonized people. And this happened most prominently in the Americas and Australia among the indigenous people. So in the Middle East, what today we call the Middle East, a term that was coined in the early 20th century, you did not have as much erasure of identity, even though you had it to an extent. So a lot of the indigenous and Islamic concepts and terminology were kind of cast aside, and they're only interesting for a historian now. But even the Muslims started to adopt the cognitive language of the Europeans. So in a way, you did have this dimming of the Islamic ways of thinking about the world. So what the civilizing mission did is that it really marginalized or even fully erased the cultures and the languages of the people who were colonized. And you still see residues of the civilizing mission. So anytime you hear Western governments or white feminists talk about saving Muslim women, so whether it's saving Muslim women from the oppression of the Taliban in Afghanistan or from the Islamic Republic theocracy, the idea here is that we have to go and civilize them. So it's not said in so many words, because the discourse of civilizing mission and the discourse of cultural superiority has fell out of favor. But then the effect of it is still there. So what's happening in the early 20th century is that colonialism is moving away from the idea of civilizing mission, so colonizing based on lack of civilization, to colonizing based on the idea of administrating or intervening on behalf of self-determination, or on the behalf of putting countries eventually towards self-determination. And a major example of this in the Middle East is the so-called mandate system. And so the mandate system was basically a division of the Middle East after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. It was the division of major parts of the Middle East, especially the Arab Middle East, between the French and the British. So, for example, the French took, or they had mandatory power over Syria and Lebanon, and the British had mandatory power over Palestine. And at first, mandatory Palestine also included present-day Jordan. So it was a very large territory. But then the British gave King Abdullah what was east of the Jordan River, and that eventually became the country of Jordan. So what is today Jordan, the country that is intercepting the Iranian missile. And there's a long history behind this, why they're actually doing Israel's so-called dirty work, is because their army was trained by the British, and also they're very closely allied with the Americans and the British, and they have relatively normal relations with Israel, and they're intercepting missiles on their behalf, because I think the Arab masses would be happy to see the missiles go through the Jordanian airspace and hit Israeli infrastructure in response to their unprovoked attacks on Arab countries and on Iran. But Jordan is intercepting them. And what's really interesting is that when the Jordan was created, so out of the mandate system comes the country of Jordan, it did not have natural resources. So it was just like a very bizarre border that was drawn. And so it's not a very sensical country in a sense, the borders that it has. So because of lack of resources, it has been dependent on the British first and now the Americans for aid. And that's how it survives, and that's how it has to do the American and the Israelis' dirty work in the Middle East. So the mandate system basically creates this mandatory system administrated by the French and the British, and the negotiations over, how the land is divided between the French and the British is secret. So the people, the inhabitants of the Middle East don't find out about it, but then one day they find out that they're under British mandate or under the French mandate. With the mandate system, the idea is that we administrate on your behalf towards self-determination, because as a culturally and morally and civilizationally less developed, and also politically less developed nation, you're not really ready for self-determination or for self-government. And then you have the Second World War, and after the Second World War, you have the United Nations. That is an organization that comes after the League of Nations, and the idea of United Nations is to secure peace between nations. And another big accomplishment of the United Nations was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have self-determination from the aftermath of the First World War, and after the Second World War, you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have self-determination and human rights going together, and human rights becomes a very prominent discourse, and it's not something that you can escape from. It carries a lot of currency, and I think this is the reason that after the after the Second World War, and especially in recent decades, most of the imperialist wars that have been waged, they have been waged on the behalf of human rights and democracy. So again, going back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and also the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the idea of human rights and democracy and women's rights, those were at the center of those regime change wars. And again, coming back to, say, the Arab Spring and the invasion of Libya in 2011, again, the idea of democracy and human rights was central to those regime change wars. So in colonialism, you go from the civilizing mission to the idea of we colonize on your behalf towards self-determination. And then after the Second World War, after the 1940s, the idea become that we colonize in order to give you democracy and human rights. So a major consequence of the discourse on self-determination is that the colonies start to demand their self-determination, and not just based on the mandate system where there is this mandatory British or French power that is administrating you towards self-determination. Rather, they want self-determination on their own terms. And what happens after the Second World War is that the power of the European colonial empires, primarily the British and the French, weakens, and you have these wars of independence where the colonies began to gain their political independence, and there is a very large political decolonization where you have the emergence of these sovereign nation states that are no longer being administrated by the likes of the British and the French Empire. And so what happens after political decolonization is that it is no longer useful to talk about, say, cultural or moral inferiority. So that exhausts its use. So back in, say, the 19th century or earlier, it had uses because through the discourse on cultural inferiority or through the discourse of civilizing mission, you could come and dispossess people of their land and identity. But now that that is no longer as relevant, and you have a political decolonization and you have these sovereign nation states, what is more convenient and what is more useful is to demonize political difference. And so you no longer demonize culture. And in fact, there's an attempt in the West, including in the cultural discourses and the academic discourses, to humanize the culture of the colonized people. So you talk about how great their culture is. You talk about the people, and that is why in the regime change discourse that we have today, there's always the people that you value and the people that you want to liberate, and so the Iranian people are good, but the Iranian regime is really bad. A funny example of this is Rick Steves, and Rick Steves recently had a post about the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. And so Rick Steves is an American who makes documentaries for PBS, for American Public Television, and he goes around the world and he travels and he shows different countries and different cities. And years ago he went to Iran, and so he had a post that, the Iranian people were so great and the culture is so great. But then he added that, they live under, these are his adjectives, theocratic, repressive, brutal dictatorship. So the idea here is that, if we bomb them or if we, launch a war on them, be careful about the culture and the people, be nice to them, but, the regime is bad. And in a way you can weaken or eliminate political difference, but be nice to the culture. And so the idea here is that you can have self-government, but you cannot have too much of it. And countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Iran, they're guilty of having too much self-government. And because of this, even though the people and the culture are nice, the political difference is bad, and we have to eliminate political difference. So in a way, the move away from the idea of cultural inferiority, so the colonialist discourse on how the culture is so inferior or they're morally inferior, that is not really like an advancement among Westerners, because it's no longer convenient. It's not as useful anymore to say that, oh, your culture is terrible or your morality is inferior and therefore we come and colonize you. That is no longer as relevant. But what is relevant now is that you have to fit within the U.S.-led imperialist order. And if you have too much sovereignty, if you have too much political difference, if you have too much self-government, that is not allowed, because that disturbs that U.S.-led imperialist system. So we come after you. We're no longer concerned about erasing your culture or your identity. Rather, we're concerned about erasing your political difference. The U.S.-Israeli aggression against Iran is very much an instance of colonial wars, and it's a continuation of colonial wars. Rather, it's just happening in a new form that is more concerned with political difference. What will happen after the U.S. strike on Iran? And I think there are several possibilities here. And one is that, going back to the earlier reports that I was mentioning, that this was theatrics and it was staged and the damage was minimal, and the U.S. had communicated indirectly with the Iranians earlier that they do not want a full-blown war. And then Iran will just do a symbolic strike, so similar to what happened in 2020 after General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. Iran targeted the American base in Iraq, but didn't kill any of the soldiers, and then there was no more escalation. So that could happen. There could be this de-escalation, after a symbolic Iranian response. And then a ceasefire through the international community between Iran and Israel. But the other possibility is that the damage was extensive and Iran needs to establish deterrence, so they will respond heavily and then we'll go up the escalation ladder. And then it could actually lead to a full regional war, which is something that I think most of us do not want to see and do not, it would be a very scary scenario. I mean, even some argue that from a regional war, it could lead to World War III and it could be a full-blown world war that would be quite frightening. And then the third possibility is that Iran responds to Israel only. And that's what they've been doing since the Americans' attack yesterday, is that they've been hitting Israel with barrage of missiles, but they have not responded to the Americans yet. So it could just be between Iran and Israel, and then eventually Israel wears thin because the Israelis are not used to extended instability. I mean, I think the Israeli air post before this war on June 13th that Israel initiated, they've been closed at most for a day and a half, but now they're closed for extended periods of time. Israeli economy is suffering. There's sirens at all times. There's instability in the life of the Israelis and the settlers. So I think Israel's war efforts, if the Americans don't assist them directly, will wear thin, and there could be a ceasefire in the coming weeks if, again, the U.S. doesn't get directly involved and the Iranian retaliation doesn't increase the escalation ladder. Or the other scenario, the other possibility is that the Israeli war effort doesn't wear thin and there's just a continuation and it'll be a long-term war between Iran and Israel. But again, I'm a historian. I don't like to predict the future too much. But these are some of the possibilities that are being thrown around in various medias, whether it's the Western legacy media or the resistance media. They're all presenting these possibilities, and we have to see what happens. And the last possibility that is mainly presented in the Western media is the fall or the collapse of the Iranian government. And this is what they thought would happen in the early days of Israel's unprovoked attacks, but that has not happened, and I think is probably the least likely possibility. It is not impossible. That is a possibility, but I think of all the things that I recounted, that is probably the least likely possibility. But we have to wait and see what happens.